From fish and chips to bangers and mash, from Alan Moore to Matthew Vaughn, from Ollie Davis to Adam Blampier, and of course, Kate Arnell and Helen Flanagan. As I've mentioned before, I think it's safe to say I fancy quite a bit of British culture. And still, no matter how important it is to America's neighbors from across the pond, it still amazes me just how little many Americans actually know about British pro wrestling. And while last time I did cover the history of said topic, one video definitely doesn't cover it all. But fortunately, once again, it's the topic of an episode, because today, Dave knows even more about British-style pro wrestling. Previously, I went from the end of the Victorian era to the mid-20th century, and while I did give a very brief run-through after that time, there is a very distinct reason why I stopped at that point. It's because it was during this era that British wrestling would go through another glorious change, and it would be a change not only for England, but one that would change the entire world of pro wrestling forever. Let's begin by talking about Shirley Crabtree Jr., better known as Big Daddy. Big Daddy was a British pro wrestler. You might have caught glimpses of him in the last episode if you aren't familiar. Now, he was known as a big man, being billed as having a 64-inch chest. He also had a bit of a following as a tag team wrestler, famously teaming with another British legend, Giant Haystacks. Shirley started his career as a babyface, or as it's known in England as Blue-Eyed. He was billed as Blonde Adonis Shirley Crabtree until he went into early retirement in 1966. Several years later, and Crabtree would make his comeback, but this time as a heel. And this is when he began to make his mark on the British wrestling scene. At this point, British wrestlers were mostly blue-eyed, plain technical wrestlers, and fans cheered them for their in-ring ability. Now, as great as this is, and it is great, there was a little bit of pageantry missing from the equation, which Big Daddy was about to cure. Crabtree came back as a heel in 1972, but it would take 2 years before he would adopt his famous Big Daddy gimmick. The character was based off of the cat on a hot tin roof character Harvey Big Daddy Pollitt, as played by Bert Ives. Crabtree used his charisma along with help from his brother Max, who was one of the finest wrestling promoting minds of all time, to bring heelery and gimmicks back to British pro wrestling. Now, you see, big gimmicks came and went throughout the years in English wrestling, but it was Crabtree who was most notable for bringing it back in the modern era. So even though he wasn't the greatest technical wrestler, Crabtree was eventually able to get his character over and actually turn babyface, or blue-eyed. As his career went on, Shirley Crabtree used his momentum to help get other wrestlers over. Many young and up-and-coming talents from the UK had tag team matches with Big Daddy before they would go on to make it big themselves. This served as a great learning experience for young wrestlers to see firsthand how to wrestle like a superstar from the OG. Crabtree used his personality and his relatability with his working man persona to connect with the crowd in a way that no one else ever had before in England. So just like how Dusty Rhodes was the American dream, the British dream might just have been Big Daddy. So that explains how big gimmicks came back to England, but what about actual wrestling? How did that evolve to the next level? Well, wrestling's evolution began in one of the most legendary schools of all time, the Snake Pit. The Snake Pit was built in Wigan, Lancashire, England, an area already well known for being the best breeding ground for catch wrestlers. The school was built by trainer Billy Riley along with some of his students and was a bare-bones facility. Allegedly, there wasn't even a toilet. Billy Riley was also notoriously strict as a teacher, so much so that he could possibly give Stu Hart the 7 and out when it comes to being tough on students. That's a pool term in case you have no idea what I'm talking about. Stu Hart may have been a tough taskmaster, but he didn't make his students build the school they trained in, now did he? Anyway, there's no arguing with the Snake Pit's results. The place churned out some of the best hookers of all time. Some of the best catch wrestlers of all time. Many great wrestlers such as Carl Gotch graduated from the pit, but it was another graduate that made a big contribution for British pro wrestling, and that man was Billy Robinson. Robinson became Britain's national champion in 1957. He also defeated an Olympic bronze medal winner in 1958 to become the European Open Wrestling champion in the light heavyweight division. He would also pass his skills down onto students of his own, even teaching in the Japanese chapter of the Snake Pit. While he did have many notable students, one of which is just another under-recognized hero of British wrestling, Marty Jones. Marty Jones began his career at only 18 years old. He would then go on to become one of the premier title holders of the Montavans World Mid-Heavyweight title, and a star in both Joint Promotions and All-Star Wrestling. He would also go on to train the famous British star Darren Matthews, better known as William Regal. However, in terms of his biggest contributions towards the world of professional wrestling, his biggest moments all started on November 12, 1976, the night when he first locked horns against Mark Rollerball Rocco. Rocco was born Mark Hussey and hailed from a long line of wrestlers. However, his family lineage didn't help his career initially. His father, Jim Hussey, actually didn't want him to become a wrestler at all, banning him from the gym that he owned. Rocco wanted it so bad that he actually sought out other wrestlers to help train him while his father was away touring. And alas, Rocco then began his own amateur wrestling career at the age of 16. From there, he would begin competing all around the world and also making it big in All-Star Wrestling. Now, the reason why Mark Rocco and Marty Jones have almost become synonymous with one another is because the two engaged in a feud that would rock the wrestling world down to its very core. Wrestler Billy Joyce retired and therefore vacated the British Light Heavyweight Championship. The new champ would be the winner of a match between Rocco and Jones. However, this first match would be just the beginning of a feud that lasted throughout the late 70s, and it would evolve not just British wrestling, but wrestling itself to a brand new plateau of greatness. Now, allow me to go further into detail about what British Pro Wrestling is really all about. Once again, as I mentioned last time, a big part of why British Pro Wrestling managed to make a comeback after 2 world wars was because of the Admiral Lord Montalvan's rules, which at least allowed wrestling to be presented in a more official kind of way. As a result, regulations held more weight in English wrestling than it did in other forms. One such ruling focused on the belief that wrestling should be viewed as very different from boxing. Therefore, punches were grounds for instant disqualification, which explains the popularity of the European uppercut. This also meant that British wrestlers had to think of something to do with their hands. Aside from inner arm strikes like the European uppercut and the lariat, the arms had to find a way to become incorporated into the style. This is why a lot of British wrestling at the time had a lot of arm manipulations and holds, or why arm contact is almost constant from transition to transition. It not only gave you something to do with your hands, but it also explained why your opponent wasn't using his arms as well. In addition, the rings in England at the time were commonly very small, less than 15 feet. This also didn't allow for a lot of room to run the ropes, meaning that the two competitors remained fairly close to one another. Also, the ring itself was also typically much harder than in other countries, meaning that falls on them hurt a lot more. This meant that high-risk maneuvers and jumping spots came at quite a cost. These factors resulted in wrestling staying in close quarters, staying on the mat, and relying on holds and pure grappling that was based off of their catch wrestling roots. British wrestling evolved from there. And now, finally, going back to Marty Jones and Mark Rocco. The two men allegedly hated each other in real life. Whenever they stepped into the ring together, they went out of their way to try and outperform one another. So with both men keeping to the mat, maintaining a lot of arm contact to transition from hold to hold, and doing this at a quick athletic pace in order to outshine their opponent, resulted in the very birth of modern day chain wrestling. Let me see. Heavy chain wrestling, real life beef, and an obscure non-mainstream feud? I think I just got smart out bingo. Now, even though these two men were the pioneers of this style of wrestling, they seldom get the credit for it. The men who do get the credit for it are Satoru Sayama and England's own Tom Billington, better known by their respective ring names, Tiger Mask and the Dynamite Kid. The reason for this is that both Jones and Rocco continued to influence others and to wrestle around the world, helping to spread chain like wrestling's version of Johnny Appleseed. Sayama himself actually cut out the middleman by wrestling in England under the name Sammy Lee for a time. Anyway, after returning to Japan, Sayama began wrestling as the Tiger Mask gimmick, and thus began Sayama having his legendary matches with the Dynamite Kid. These matches really helped to put Chain on the map, and it gave it a big international audience. It even became so popular that the style eventually came to America and the WWF. Oh, and by the way, one of Tiger Mask's other big rivals was the character Black Tiger, who was actually played by Mark Rocco. So while the Dynamite Kid and Tiger Mask may not have invented the style of wrestling, they did help to popularize it, which counts for something in and of itself. Now, to be clear, modern day Chain took a lot of influence from a plethora of sources, but make no bones about it, a lot of its DNA comes from jolly old England, and it comes from not just the Dynamite Kid, but largely from two of Great Britain's finest, Mark Rocco and Marty Jones. Well, there you go, just another look at British style pro wrestling. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and please check me out on Twitter and on Patreon. Thanks so much for watching, and this has been Dave Knows.